Yes, sir. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic and state of emergency, this meeting is being held by a live video teleconference pursuant to 2020 Senate Bill 150 and in accordance with KRS 61826 because it's not feasible to offer a primary physical location for the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. The purpose of today's meeting is a follow-up to Monday evening's meeting for the committee. Craig, do you want to offer some comments on Monday evening's meeting?
Certainly, I'd be glad to. If it'd be okay with the chair, if we could move forward with approving the meeting summary from last Wednesday first.
Oh, sure. I'm sorry. I must have missed that email. Bring that up really quickly. Hopefully everyone has had a chance to review the minutes. I apologize that I was not able to. I'm quite positive they're well thought through, knowing Craig. Does anybody else have any comments in regard to the minutes previously provided? If not, is there a motion to accept the minutes as written?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor, please raise your hand and say aye. Any opposed? The minutes are accepted as written unanimously. Now, Craig, shall we move on to the necessary review of Monday evening's meeting?
Yes, sir. Thank you. So as everybody knows, we had a public input meeting this past Monday, the 19th at 6 p.m., and that was held via Zoom. We did have 66 registrants for that meeting. It looks like, according to the information I downloaded from Zoom, we had 42 people actually attend the meeting. There were some written comments ahead of that meeting, which I provided to task force members this morning. You should have received those via email just so you could review those. And in addition, we reserved about half of that meeting for verbal comments, to receive comments from the community. And we did receive comments from a number of stakeholders. We heard from Jenna Greathouse with Commerce Lexington, David Hill, who is a realtor, Dick Murphy, who's an attorney, Nick Nicholson, who's also an attorney, Brittany Rothmeyer with the Fayette Alliance, and Todd Johnson with the BIA of Central Kentucky. So I'm glad to go into as much or as little detail as you'd like to hear about those, but what I do have is just some actionable ideas that came from those comments that I'd like to review, and then I can go into additional detail if you'd like me to. First, the big note that came out of all of this is that there was really no global objections or comments regarding the proposed weighting that this task force has been working on, or really more globally, the overall framework that's being proposed. There was no objection to proceeding as you've been proposing over these last several meetings. Some of the actionable ideas that did come out of the comments is that we may want to take a look at instituting or implementing a public education process as we complete implementation of the study. I believe it may be beneficial as we reach the conclusion of the study and begin to implement. People are still really learning and understanding how the framework works, how it all fits together. So I think as this moves forward through the Planning Commission and to council, there would be benefit to have a public education process, maybe a few different sessions online or something like that, just to review how this is all proposed to work as we get further down the line. Another thing that came up as part of the comments that also came up in past task force meetings is that small area plans should be considered as a tool for any expansion discussion. And again, this task force has had that discussion during past meetings and came to that same conclusion. So there was a couple of the comments from the public provided some support for moving forward with that approach through only expanding in conjunction with the development of a small area plan. The next steps of identifying land for future urban development and rural land for long-term preservation are vital to the implementation of the plan and should proceed at the Planning Commission level in the near future. So really this, if you remember back from some of our first meetings, the goal in the comp plan that calls for this study also calls for those next steps of identifying land suitable for future urban development and rural land that should be preserved long-term. So that's an actionable idea that also came out of that meeting, that we should continue in that way, and that the Planning Commission should proceed immediately, if at all possible, with those tasks. And then finally, there were a number of comments related to just, well, I think one of the best comments just stated that we should show our work. And that kind of encapsulates what I'm about to say. The vacant land use map and the other exhibits that are referred to in some of the documents that have been released and presented to the task force should be provided in much more detailed formats. I think we're getting to the point where it's appropriate to post those online, and that'll just allow the public and others really to view that information, to download the vacant land use map, to drill down into that and really take a look at the work that we've done. We've had that information available all along, but there's been minor amendments as we've gone through the process. So I think we're getting to the point now is this, as you consider transmitting this to the Planning Commission, that we would put that online. So with that, those are my comments. Mark Butler from Stantec was also attending the meeting along with several members of his team. Mark, if you have any other kind of global comments you'd like to add to that, that'd be fine. Other than that, I'm glad to answer any questions or provide additional details if you'd like them.
My only real thing I'd add was that I think we all felt the verbal comments from the meeting were in line with what we had heard from those particular folks before. That they have basically maintained the points that they wanted to make, and they were making them there. So in that sense, we didn't hear anything new or out of line with what we would understand that their concerns are. I would say that we were, whether pleasantly surprised or appreciable that nobody really did make a criticism or request a fundamental alteration of the framework mechanisms, the use of the questions, the use of the calculation of capacity, the weights, the system of weighting versus scoring points. That is really at the end of the day, what we're trying to deliver is that framework. So in some senses, the comments were not really on the target of the framework, but more on the process, the question of, whether expansion is necessary or not in general. So I feel like the framework itself came out relatively unscathed with with no real particular criticism. And had the discussion and talked about the framework a little bit more, I think we would have tried to emphasize that it is flexible to incorporate other scenarios that maybe take into account a different perspective than the 3 scenarios we've put in there, but the framework is intended to be flexible enough to accept additional scenarios, in that the framework is flexible enough to, for the weightings to change and the even additional questions to be added or questions to be removed. That's what's going forward. We are providing this initial framework that with the data and the methodology for going through the evaluation process of what we believe to be scenarios that have a higher probability of occurring, whether they're on one side of the spectrum or another, but they're all within the comp plan, but not to the exclusion of any other scenarios that eventually could be requested to be tested or evaluated. And so that really didn't seem to be an issue or a question, but that would have been like my response if people had been more engaged in that framework area. But it seems like the framework itself was not too much in question. And I don't know if Cynthia or John had any other thoughts. And that's it for me.
And again, we're glad to go into any additional detail that you'd like. Glad to answer any questions.
Well, I do have a comment. I don't know if it's a question or a comment. I thought I also heard in the public comments before and at the public meeting, questions about the data itself and some of the assumptions behind the data. And I'm curious if there's some way to address some of those issues that were raised, because the starting point has to be available land. And I thought I heard some questions raised about that.
I can answer that, Mark. Mr. K, we certainly can download all of the data assumptions into an Excel file, and people can pivot and look at that information by area or by parcel. We can collapse it so it's not so fine grained, but we can make all of those data assumptions available either in a very granular level or in a more aggregated level, because every assumption for every parcel is documented.
And I think that was incumbent of, that was the part of, encompassed in that question of show your work. You know, our assumptions have been based on the zoning code, and then when anything we diverted from the zoning code in the second and third scenarios, you know, we noted, as Cynthia pointed out, in the database. I mean, the real technical question is how to present that data that has so many records and is tied to a geospatial database in a way that's that is accessible. And that's something I think is really, we are providing it to the planning staff, and to the degree that we can keep it simple, we you know, we can definitely, you know, work to that goal. And then, as Cynthia said and Craig said, there are certain summary type maps and stuff that we can put on our own website, or we can also do in addition to that to accompany it. But our report will explain the assumptions for each scenario in a summary fashion, so that it's clear how our assumptions came out, including our directives about, you know, like assuming that agricultural land is included, assuming that anything inside the urban service boundary is included, because I do think that's a part of why people are somewhat confused is, you know, the same issues that everybody has is, how can some people think that there's only so much land and we think there's so much more? It's about, you know, the directives of what we consider land that is available for development, and so those will be part of like our final report for describing the assumptions used in the scenarios.
I think that would be helpful. And I'll just make one more point, and that is a part of the underlying impetus for doing all of this study was to get to a place where there's broad agreement about the basics. Right now, I think it's fair to say we don't have that. And I understand why that might not be possible at this point. And we're not talking yet about next steps, but it seems to me that some of what we heard really requires more conversation, and if nothing else, identifying specifically where the differences of opinion or assessment, where those differences lie, where the areas of agreement are, and what that means about the decisions that we make in terms of policy.
Yeah, I think I just want to add one thing. I think you put it almost as well as it can be put. It's the differences of opinion, you know, about those assumptions that I think are that catching point right now. So it's those differences of opinion about what might actually get developed, what's actually available to be developed. You know, we've talked specifically about Overbrook Farm, you know, in areas like that. And so there are just very, you know, important differences of opinion about how and if to even include properties like that in the analysis. And I think that we went under the direction that the task force gave us. But if you'd given us different direction, we would have had different numbers. if we had decided that, the opinion of the task force was not to include those types of properties. And so I think that that's really the big item that's the sticking point, is that matter of opinion about what should be considered as available and developable. And I don't know that we'll ever get there based on what we've heard over the last year, that we'll ever get to that point.
I think one of the interesting things to keep in mind with this process, the way it's been put together and the way it's been proposed, is that there will be an annual update to the data. I mean, we're going to be taking a fresh look at everything on an annual basis. And so if it becomes clear, if there's a piece of property that's included for development, that it becomes clear that for whatever reason, it's not going to be developed, there's going to be kind of an annual assessment of that, where we can take a fresh look at that, and there can be adjustments to the way we're collecting the data, or the way we're reviewing the data, and the way the scenarios are put together to react to that. So this is not a static study that's just going to move forward and never change. It'll be evaluated and amended. The data, at least, will be amended on an annual basis, and there'll be chances to make those adjustments depending on what development trends look like moving forward.
Craig, that's a very, very good point. They've got to realize that this is very fluid. At the end of the day, the properties are owned by people. They have the right to say if they're going to sell it or not. And as we heard earlier, this one piece of tract that they said, well, it'll never go up for sale. Well, it went up for sale 2 weeks later. So this is very fluid and will always be changing. But now we have the analytics in place to help us make these decisions after we get all the information inputted like we should.
So there is a consensus that the work product should be shown in a more detailed fashion, the mapping. At what point in time can that be put out on the website?
Well, I don't know that we can put it out on our website because it requires, certain elements can. And we will be putting, I think I can work with, really it's just, I can work with Cynthia to develop the kind of maps that we believe are appropriate in the scope, that can be downloaded and reviewed. Certainly there's the database itself, the geodatabase itself, we will turn that over to the planning staff. We do not have a contract to provide like the online capacity for that, right? But they do. They have an online data portal. To a certain degree, we can work with them to make that more accessible. But at the end of the day, the accessibility of that geodatabase itself is a question that we have to work out with the planning staff. For the time being, I think we're talking about like high resolution PDFs for the website. And we will work with the planning staff, first of all, to make sure that they're comfortable with what we're giving them. And so that's in the next few weeks. I think we need to schedule those kinds of review sessions with them to make sure that they're comfortable with everything they're seeing. And then from there, whatever ultimate plans for the geodatabase would probably lie within the hands of the planning staff, planning commission.
So is 2 weeks a realistic expectation for the information to be out there to the general public, Craig?
It sounds like based on what Mark is saying, it sounds like it may be closer to a few weeks before we can get those discussions underway and get that data out there. I think a lot of it already exists. It's just a matter of kind of refining the way it's going to be presented. I mean, the data was used to develop the study, so we definitely want it out there. We want people to take a look at it. Mark is correct that there was an optional component of the scope where we were going to look at putting out a data clearinghouse, and that was not ultimately funded through the first phase of this. So that's potentially a future phase to provide even more data online. But in the meantime, it's like we were saying, just some higher resolution PDFs. It's a matter of, when you take a look at the report, if you try to zoom in on certain inset exhibits and things like that on the pages, if they can be provided separately in a higher resolution so people can really understand them. That's what we're talking about initially here.
And I think we can get those on our website. I mean, because our website is not intended to be this heavy data intensive website. It's intended to be kind of a presentation website for the study. And so there's a limit to like how big of a files and how complicated the file downloading system can be. So we can do simple things like PDFs, but really when you're talking about like web-based applications to go through geospatial databases, the city has the data portal that allows people to download shape files and stuff like that. Again, it really comes down to what they're comfortable with as far as what they want to put on the portal. And we're willing to work with them about if they have, basic suggestions, we'll work with them, but ultimately it's their portal.
And so there's a easy option that we can probably work with, Mark, is we could put a link on the study website that just, forwards that request to the city's website where we can have all of that information housed. That would be completely fine.
So is 3 weeks a realistic expectation to have all this information out there? I'm trying to get to some kind of a timeline.
Sure.
To understand.
I think that's realistic. I think it's reasonable.
And then the planning commission work session. So that 3 weeks is August the 11th or somewhere around there. So, and then the planning commission work session is August the 28th. No, not the 28th.
It is
The third Thursday.
The third Thursday. Okay.
tentatively scheduled for the 19th.
I mean, that's a little over a week for everyone in the public to review it and have ability at the planning commission work session to make comments. That seems reasonable to me.
Now, and I want to be clear though, we are not to the layperson, this will still be difficult data to navigate in the sense that they have to understand how to use a spatial database. I mean, we're not making like a user-friendly, put in your address and find your lot service. Like you would have to be able to understand how to, like use the ArcMap servers that they may have, or have some other expertise, because if it's just what the city puts out, they give you a shapefile and you have to know how to use it.
To be clear though, the other component of that, just having the visual like vacant land map in a larger format so that it can be, printed at a 24/36 if somebody wanted to, and it wouldn't lose clarity. There's no issue with providing that.
Correct.
So I was trying to respond to one, putting the work product or the more detailed information out there, and then two, the comment about people having enough time to actually review it, in the detailed information to provide comment on.
Yeah, and I agree. I'm sorry, I got a little bit off track. The maps should be available very soon, and we can review the maps. The database will be available, but again, it will be a database. That's all.
So when do we think the maps would be available?
I think there needs to be more work than just putting, higher resolution maps on the website. What I heard in the public comments the other day was that the data are very dense and it's a very complex study. I think if we added a little more body to the text to explain the decision matrices, to explain exactly where the data came from, beef it up a little bit so it's a little more user-friendly for John Q. Public. So I think there are basically three parts that need to be beefed up: the decision matrix, the body of the data that looks at all of the graphs, where all those maps came from, and then the third thing is those higher resolution.
And Mark, my belief would be that your final report would respond appropriately to Lynn's comment.
Correct, absolutely.
I also think 1 week is not enough time. We got our 110-page document and only had a week to review it. And we're the ones who are dedicated to doing this.
Yeah,
So,
Lynn, I agree. I agree totally.
So does the recommendation not go to the planning commission work session until the following month? Craig?
That's certainly an option if we'd like the data out there for a longer period of time before the meeting. That first planning commission meeting, as I understand it, is truly a work session where we're describing the process to them and starting to get their comments. It gives them a chance to dig in and kind of work through this. It doesn't go to public hearing until the next month in September. And again, all of these dates are tentative, and they are based on a recommendation coming out of the task force meeting today. So there's all sorts of assumptions tied to this right now. But we can proceed either way. If the recommendation from the task force is that the data be provided and reside on a server and a website for a certain amount of time before there's any public or planning commission input on this, we can proceed that way as well. There's flexibility in that regard.
I just heard Lynn and Ann both agree that 1 week isn't enough. So,
Yeah, I think two at the least, I would believe.
which would mean it would get pushed to the next work session, in my opinion. Is there a portal that people could provide comment in advance of that work session?
Well, we definitely have, and I believe Jim Duncan's on the call here today, but we from the study side, we definitely always are accepting public comment through the website, through lexingtonsustainablegrowth.com. But I know that there's a mechanism as well for public comment regarding items that are coming before the planning commission, and Jim Duncan or Chris Woodall may want to say more about that.
Good afternoon, Jim Duncan here. We have a planning mailbox email that we receive comments for most planning commission items. So it's called Planning Mailbox, and people can certainly submit comments that way. We can make sure that email address is publicized.
One thing I wanted to comment on is John mentioned that the committee directed the Stantec team not to. The committee directed the Stantec team to include all AR parcels, as even though they're privately held and may or may not be developed in the near term. The committee didn't direct the Stantec team to include those. The planning staff did made that direction, is my belief.
Okay, sorry.
That's all right. I just that was just a note.
Right, as a matter of policy on all past land use planning done in the city, any agricultural zoned land that's within the urban service boundary is considered developable. It's considered that it will be rezoned, or there'll be a zone change and it will develop. So that's one of the assumptions we moved forward with on this study. However, I know I sound like a broken record, but there's reevaluation of this coming up. And so if there's a particular piece of land that just isn't developing, and we're running up against an issue where one of our land use types is running low other than for that particular parcel, we can consider that at that time and exclude it for the purposes of analysis during one of the updates. So just putting that out there as a possibility. I think the framework is objective and flexible enough to accommodate any of those types of adjustments that we would make in the future.
In a similar vein, this work that's being provided, in my opinion, isn't making policy about which scenario is going to be adopted as growth moves forward. It's just, we're providing if-then statements. If this happens, this is what's going to happen. You know, scenario 2 happens, this is how long it can go. Scenario 3 happens, this is how long it can go. So in 5 years, you know, if our city leaders are not making tough decisions and allowing for some controversial infill to move forward, scenario one is going to be the scenario that has to be accepted. So I wanted to get that out there. In my opinion, that's just fact. This is just providing information for our city leaders to make hard decisions with.
And I think we may need to do a better job of also explaining, in addition to like the directive about including AR land for development, that the directive was to say, what is our build out scenario? With the, it wasn't to say like, what do we think is the most probable scenario of build out of development in 5 or 10 years. It was to say like, what is the land available for development and what would it look like if it was developed? And we used 3 different scenarios to fill it up. So in some sense, it is a little bit over optimistic in the premise that, yeah, no one is expecting that every single vacant parcel or every single obviously underutilized parcel gets redeveloped. But from the perspective of how we set up these scenarios, they were to build out inside the urban service boundary. To Craig's point, and to what I've said before, we can do another scenario, or the planning staff can do another scenario that is, more selective about what, the land that gets included. But our directives, including not in addition to including AR land, it was to put up a build out scenario on everything that was intended to be developed. And so that's what we have in those scenarios. And as we move forward, when we see development occurring, that land will come out of the capacity side of the ledger and into the developed side of the ledger. And we'll have less land available for development, and the calculations will change and show that. And so to your point, it's like, we will see what trajectory we're on. And as that trajectory becomes more clear, it's the policy of expansion will be more in line with what is actually has been developed, as opposed to what is in any particular scenario.
I have 2 things, if you don't mind. Craig, the first thing is a simple thing. Are we going to get a summary of the public input in some form? And is that going to be incorporated into the final product in some way?
Certainly, I can. I have some notes from that meeting. I'd be glad to share those, to clean those up and to share those with the task force if you'd like. We also posted the actual link to the video online, the hour-and-a-half meeting, but I'm glad to share after this meeting today. I should be able to, by 5 p.m., get you a summary of these comments.
That would be great. And I think to that point, just thinking about, as this recommendation goes to the Planning Commission, just thinking about how the 11 or however many people that have prioritized those different items, 9 through 19 or whatever, just thinking about if that's an appropriate sort of waiting to send to those folks, or if we need to think about making a recommendation about how different groups, either stakeholder groups or the public, is engaged to prioritize those things as part of this reevaluation process each year. Is that something that's already incorporated into this plan, or is that something that has been considered?
Well, I think what we're expecting is that the Planning Commission and even possibly council would be taking a look at those weights as well, to make sure that they are both receiving public input on that, as well as making their own decisions in that regard. So the intention was that we would have an initial recommendation come out of this task force. So they would have, it's really a good starting point for them to work with. And it's a good recommendation as well, from what I've seen. So it provides it's kind of an initial work product for them to then continue refinement on.
Craig, if I can just pop in, Chris, to follow up, I think it's important to write that up. What you believe the process looks like and what the Stantec folks are thinking is kind of murky to the rest of us. So, add a page or a couple of paragraphs at least in the document to explain that. Thank you. I'm sorry, Chris.
Sure, and there will be a final study document, but we're wanting to get this further down the line through Planning Commission before that's produced, if that makes sense. So a lot of these a lot of the things we're discussing today, it will be incorporated in the document. There will be kind of an instruction manual for staff to update this data on an annual basis. So there'll be both a discussion in that document of, kind of the objective of this and how it was carried out, and the details of how that works, as well as more detailed information to the end user as staff for how to implement this in the future. So all of that will be available. We didn't want to create that at this time for a couple of reasons. First, it would cause some additional delays between your meetings. And second, we anticipate that there's going to be some changes to that as this moves forward through public input and adoption through the Planning Commission. So we didn't want to hand you a large document, kind of a how-to document of how the data is going to be updated and all of that type of information at this time until we get further down the line.
I understand that. Sorry, my question was more just hoping that that final document has some sort of recommendation about how the public is engaged. So what the sort of framework is for engaging and quantifying those things. As Jim Duncan said, they get emails in that planning inbox or whatever, but then understanding, do they just put a tally in for or against, and that's how it's tabulated? Or is there a more sophisticated way, especially with this conversation, where either private individuals or members of stakeholder groups, like the list that was in that presentation, are engaged to give them time to provide input on the prioritization of those things, so that that becomes part of that evaluation, and it's not just this behind the green curtain planning staff evaluation, that it is that the public understands that they're going to have a quantifiable opportunity to say, we want this to happen, or these are the important things in our community.
I'd like to add, in addition to the statement Craig made about the weighting, the same holds in that the Planning Commission is going to also weigh in on that weighting. They're also going to weigh in on the percentage of demand that this is not meeting. At the last meeting, we established 50% as the committee's recommendation. I expect that the Planning Commission is going to heavily weigh in on that too. Don't you agree, Craig?
I would expect there to be discussion kind of across everything that's in the recommendation. They're going to want to hear more about it and probably add their input on each one of those items.
If I can jump back in, so that I don't want to, again, jump ahead of where we are, but it raises the question in my mind, what are we conveying to the Planning Commission? Are we conveying a report, but it's not the recommendation of the task force finally about a process? Or are we, and I guess I'm asking the question because it sounds like there's a lot of pieces that aren't in there yet. And I could be comfortable conveying the report as a report, but not as the final work of this task force, which was to be working on a process which we don't have in place.
The intention from the staff side was to transmit the initial report that was completed, all of the background data along with that, and as well as the evaluation framework that has been developed with the help of the task force. Both of those items would move forward for their additional consideration.
Okay.
And Chair, I apologize, that jumped forward right into the next agenda item. So we moved ahead a little bit there.
No apology needed. What other topics do we want to discuss? Who else wants to provide input? Well, to me, we move on to the next item, which is providing a recommendation to the Planning Commission work session.
So again, this is just to open this up. You'll notice in your packet that there was a copy of the presentation that was provided during the public input meeting on Monday evening. Our intention is not to go back through that, but I did ask that Mark provide just a real quick review of those 2 or 3 slides that discuss the framework, just to provide a refresher, as well as read into the record that information once again, because we would be, from the staff side, recommending that the task force move that forward to the Planning Commission if you see fit today. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mark to present that information for discussion.
Can you see the slide?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So basically, again, the framework is to, as well, let me start with this slide. The general process is to have this database that pulls data from the parcel level data and planning data, as well as other PVA data, as well as all kinds of market data that we've included here for developing growth trends. But collect and organize the data, establish the demand through a 20-year horizon period, identify scenarios, build out scenarios that, and for this study, for this purpose, we were limited to build out scenarios within the existing boundary of the urban service boundary, but there's no reason why the framework itself, it doesn't have the capacity to include scenarios that have an explicit expansion program as well. And then evaluate these scenarios as identified through the framework based on the criteria that we've identified. And then we would then provide the results of that framework to the decision-making policy board of the Planning Commission, and ultimately the Urban County Council would have the same access to the results of this information. So the framework is basically 2 steps. There's the first aspect is capacity. We have 4 areas of land use demand. We have projections that we include a high and low a range that includes a high and low trend line based on recent 10-year and 20-year inventory and demand trends. And at this point, our questions are, does it meet at least 100% of the low 20-year demand? And does the scenario then also meet 75% of the high demand, with the premise that if it can meet 75%, then the urgency of any direct immediate decision is low, and there's still time to monitor and assess how this trajectory of development is continuing. After that, the scenarios are then tested along questions about how well they align with the stated goals of the comprehensive plan. Again, if the comprehensive plan stated goals change, then it would be necessary and important to change the questions that we're asking. But these questions that we're asking in this framework, in the framework we're presenting initially, are from the current adopted comprehensive plan. And so that's when we develop our evaluation and weighting system. And we ask those questions based on the matrix, on the metrics. And the analyst will score them on points based on how well each metric addresses the question. The weighting established by policy will be multiplied by those points to develop a score. And then at this point, if it achieves a score of at least 50% of the possible total points available, then it would be considered in compliance with the overall question, does this align with meeting the goals of the comprehensive plan? And that is what we would report back to the Planning Commission and other policy decision makers, that this scenario as envisioned does have capacity, and it does or does not align with the comprehensive plan. And again, it's intended to be an iterative approach that suggests that you really shouldn't just, of course, settle for the first scenario that we're including as our scenario 1, where it's just the zoning capacities and zoning allowable uses that are currently there, but should also consider whatever adjustments you would have to make in order to take to try to meet and accommodate future demand without having to expand. But that at some point, if those types of adjustments are considered too impractical or not viable, then expansion becomes something that should be brought up as a consideration for, or brought up for consideration. So that's basically the scenario or the framework itself. And that is what, in essence, we are recommending to be moved forward as the framework, including all the foundational elements of the data and systems for weighting and et cetera.
Does anyone have any comments about moving this report forward to the Planning Commission work session? Would anyone like to make a motion that we move this report forward and submit it to the Planning Commission work session for their review?
So move.
Is there a second?
Are we specific on which session? It would be the next session or the one in September?
Good question, Price. I think it would be the one in September to satisfy the request about people having enough time to review the work product.
Great, thanks. Then I'll second the motion.
We'll call it to a vote unless anybody has any conversation about it. All those in favor?
I'm sorry. We're just
Yes.
trying to get unmuted. I do have a comment.
Okay.
I'm comfortable moving this forward so long as there's some description of the discussion we've had about the nature of this report, so that it's clear to people what it is and what it is not. And I think that's really crucial especially for the public. But I think the Planning Commission will probably get it, and eventually council members also. But I think it's important to have in writing something that provides a frame for what we are planning, what this report does and does not do.
Well, I will say this, that the report will include everything that we've discussed in various parts throughout the course of the study. It will not be a rehash of the existing and conditions report, but it will certainly reference that report. The report will identify the data that is involved in the framework. It'll identify the scenarios in the description of the scenarios and the assumptions made in the scenarios. And it'll describe the process of the framework and the evaluation of each scenario through that framework. And in this report, report out the results of this initial framework, this initial evaluation. It'll also have like some basic, recommendations or lessons learned that Craig mentioned before about maybe the possibility of, some of the things that people have spoken about, a small urban area plan, but those will just simply be more of like an end, end remarks as to be added on. But it would also, and it can very easily include the method by which, what we recommend for how weighting is done, and et cetera. But really, that's, to me, the weighting will be a policy determination that we will learn from the work session and the Planning Commission going forward, how they want to do it. And that's kind of one of the reasons why we'll leave that tentative for the time being. But the framework itself that includes weighting will definitely be fully explained.
So now I thought I understood, and now I'm confused. So there's going to be another report that we have not seen that is also going to be, is that going to be a report from the consultants, or is that a report from this body?
We were talking about the documentation that will go along with this framework.
Yeah, there will eventually, Vice Mayor, there will eventually be a much more detailed document to assist with the implementation of the framework. That's really largely for staff use that will follow a planning commission discussion.
And that will not be reviewed by this body.
It can be provided to this group, and if there's a need for further discussion, we could certainly do that. But the intent was to put that together because it's really more from the staff side with implementation. We were looking at putting that together at a later date.
Okay, so what we are approving today is simply the report that we've seen, which is
Framework, yeah, the
frame-
framework
the
report.
conditions, that large report, which includes
Right.
the framework. That's what we're approving, recommending. Thank you.
Any other comment? Well, let's vote. All in favor of moving the current work provided forward to be presented to the Planning Commission work session, please raise your hand and say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We've voted to move it forward unanimously. Thank you all very much. I do, to Vice Mayor Kay's comment, I do think it would be very nice if we could all receive a copy of the report, and then for consideration, and then maybe at that point in time, somebody might have a stronger opinion about if the committee needs to meet again. Is that reasonable?
Absolutely. We'd be glad to provide that information, and we'll kind of hold the option open to bring the task force back together if necessary after that information is distributed.
And one more question. So that report will go to whom?
That report is put together subsequent to the discussions. It'll inform, it'll be informed by the Planning Commission's discussion. So they will have the draft of that before it goes to their public hearing. It'll also go to council after.
So it's a report to the Planning Commission and to the council. Is that right?
That's correct. I mean, it's essentially the completion of the remaining scope of the study.
You all aren't going to finalize this report until after you go through the Planning Commission work session, is my belief, so you can include their input.
Yes, sir. Exactly right.
Shall we open it up to public comment?
I think.
Hello,
Go on, Mark.
me, Amanda.
Oh, I'm sorry, Amanda.
That's okay. I can't, I'm on my phone, unfortunately, because life's M. So I just wanted to make sure that when I was fine to allow this to move forward, but I would like reflected somewhere in those that was not a unanimous vote for the 60%, 50% conversation. That needs to be, as long as that's a part of the conversation, then that's fine. I just want to make sure I think that's what Vice Mayor Kay was kind of alluding to. I would just like to make that point a little more finer. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Shall we open it up to public comment now?
Yes.
All right. If there's anybody in the attendees room that would like to address the task force, please raise your hand. I'm using the icon on the bottom of your screen, and you'll be brought into the meeting. Chairs, I'm seeing none.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your time and effort and hard work. We appreciate it. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
A second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Thank you all.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Much
Hey,
appreciated.
Craig,
Mhm.
before you close the meeting, maybe
Yes.
you and Mark and John and Jim Duncan and Chris Woodall, we could all stay on for a quick minute.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.